July 29, 2006, Ross County Jail, Chillicothe, Ohio. One man, gone, from a rooftop recreation yard. And the craziest part? He disguised his escape route with toothpaste and crushed Jolly Rancher candies. John Parsons was facing the death penalty for killing a police officer. On a Saturday afternoon, he climbed over razor wire using a rope made from bedsheets, newspaper, and toilet paper, descended 3 stories, and vanished into the woods. But this isn't just a story about a daring escape. It's about the 83 days he survived in the forest while hundreds of officers hunted him. The FBI 10 Most Wanted list that put a $125,000 bounty on his head. And the lumberyard shack, less than 2 miles from the jail where they finally found him sleeping. After his capture, investigators discovered he'd been using lights stolen from his victim's grave to see at night, in a town that wanted him dead. This is how one of Ohio's most wanted fugitives pulled off the most extensive manhunt in state history, and proved that freedom always has a price. John Warren Parsons wasn't always a killer. Born February 11, 1971, in Chillicothe, Ohio, he grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, a place where police officers walked the same streets as the people they protected. By his early 30s, Parsons had a criminal record: theft, drug offenses, small-time crimes that kept landing him in trouble. By 2005, at age 34, he'd been in and out of local jails multiple times. But nothing violent, nothing that suggested what was coming. April 21st, 2005, a Thursday evening. Around 5:30 p.m., Chillicothe police received a report: a car stolen from a restaurant parking lot. Just 15 minutes later, 5:45 p.m., a disguised man walked into the BP gas station on Bridge Street, armed with a gun. He demanded cash from the register. The getaway car matched the description of the stolen vehicle. Police spotted it immediately, gave chase through the residential streets of Chillicothe. The driver bailed out near North High Street, abandoned the car, took off running on foot. Multiple units converged on the area. The suspect was dangerous, armed, desperate. 6 p.m. Just after sunset, off-duty officer Larry R. Cox was walking from his parents' house to his own home, just a few blocks away. He heard the commotion, police sirens, shouting, the sound of a manhunt happening in his own neighborhood. Cox was 44 years old, a respected member of the Chillicothe Police Department, beloved by the community he served. He wasn't in uniform, wasn't armed, but he'd been a cop for years. The instinct to help was automatic. Cox joined the foot chase. Near the intersection of Chestnut and North High Streets, he spotted the suspect, running through an alleyway between houses. Cox confronted him. What happened next took only seconds. A gunshot rang out, sharp, echoing off the brick walls of the alley. Officer Larry Cox fell, shot in the neck. He died just a few houses away from his parents' home, the home he'd just left minutes earlier. The shooter was John Parsons. In that instant, Parsons went from small-time criminal to cop killer, the most reviled man in Chillicothe. How do you escape from a town that wants you dead? The community was devastated. Officer Cox wasn't just a cop, he was their neighbor, their friend, someone who dedicated his life to protecting them. His mother, Joy Cox, would later tell reporters that Larry had been walking to check on his own house, just doing what any son would do. He'd seen officers chasing someone and immediately tried to help. It cost him his life. Police threw every resource into finding the shooter. 10 days later, on May 1st, 2005, they arrested John Parsons. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, forensics, the stolen car, the gun. Parsons was charged with aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, weapons offenses, tampering with evidence, grand theft, capital charges, which meant one thing: the death penalty. Sitting in Ross County Jail in the summer of 2005, John Parsons faced a terrifying reality. He was 34 years old, and his life was essentially over. The trial would be a formality. Evidence was ironclad. The community wanted revenge. May through August 2005, each month brought him closer to trial, closer to death row. It was then that John made up his mind. He wanted to live, and the only option was to escape. Why would anyone risk everything on the impossible? Ross County Jail sat in downtown Chillicothe, built decades earlier with thick concrete walls and minimal security upgrades. It wasn't a maximum security prison. It was a county jail, designed to hold people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. But it had one unique feature: a rooftop recreation yard. 3 stories up, enclosed by brick walls and chain-link fencing, with razor wire coiled along the top. Inmates were allowed up there for exercise, fresh air, an hour at a time under guard supervision. To the jail staff, the rooftop seemed secure: high walls, razor wire, guards stationed nearby. What could go wrong? How do you escape from a rooftop 3 stories high? To someone with nothing left to lose, that rooftop was an opportunity. Parsons spent months, through late 2005, studying the jail. Every detail, every routine, every weakness. He watched the guard rotations, timed the shift changes, mapped the blind spots. He identified his opportunity: the rooftop recreation yard. He noticed that guard supervision on the rooftop was inconsistent. Sometimes officers watched closely, other times they stepped away, got distracted. During busy shift changes, the rooftop could be left with minimal observation for several minutes. That was the window, small, but there. Parsons also studied his own cell, Cell Block A, ground floor. January 2006. He began examining every inch of the walls. The walls were old concrete, painted over multiple times with thick, institutional paint, greenish blue, the color of every government building built before 1980. In the corner by his cot, Parsons noticed something: a particular brick in the wall. The mortar around it had a hairline crack. Decades of settling, temperature changes, moisture. The building was old. The mortar was failing. To anyone else, it was nothing, just an old building showing its age. To Parsons, that crack was the start of a plan. He needed a tool, something to scrape away the mortar, something small enough to hide. In his cell, he found it: the air vent cover, a metal grate held in place by screws. Parsons worked one corner of the grate back and forth, gently, quietly, over several days until the metal fatigued and a small piece snapped off. Now he had a tool, thin, sharp, perfect for chiseling. When no one was watching, Parsons began scraping at the mortar around the brick. Each night, after lights out, he worked, timing his scraping with other noises: a door slamming down the hall, an inmate shouting, the clang of metal trays. Any sound that could mask his work. The mortar was old, brittle. It crumbled easier than he expected. After days of patient work, the brick loosened. He could wiggle it, then remove it completely. Behind the brick, steel reinforcement rods. No way to squeeze through, no escape route there. But what if the hole wasn't for escaping? What if it was for hiding something? Now Parsons had something better: a hiding place. A hollow space in the wall, large enough to conceal what he was making. What was he making? A rope. The rooftop recreation yard was 3 stories high, roughly 30 feet from the top of the wall to the ground below. If Parsons could get over that wall, he'd need a way down, a long drop to freedom. But how do you make a rope in prison? He started gathering materials. His bedsheets, white institutional cotton. He tore them into long strips, whenever he could do so without being noticed. During cleaning duty, he collected old newspapers, twisted them into tight cords, braided them together with the bedsheet strips. He even used toilet paper, rolled tightly into strands, added to extend the length. Over several weeks through spring 2006, Parsons quietly crafted a surprisingly sturdy rope, maybe 40 feet long, strong enough to hold his weight. By July 2006, everything was ready. He tested it by hanging from his bunk. Pulling with all his strength, the braided materials held. Every time guards came near, he coiled the rope and stuffed it behind the loose brick, replaced the brick, made everything look normal. But there was a problem. Every time he removed and replaced the brick, the edges chipped. The mortar crumbled more. the seam became more visible. A guard doing a careful cell inspection would notice. The brick didn't fit flush anymore. The gaps were obvious. How do you hide a hole in a painted wall? Parsons needed camouflage. He came up with an ingenious solution. Using white toothpaste as a base, he crushed up Jolly Rancher hard candies, the green ones, the blue ones, mixed the colored powder into the toothpaste. The result was a paste that roughly matched the pale greenish-blue paint on the cell walls. After each work session, he'd fit the brick back in place, then smear the improvised paint into the cracks, smooth it carefully, disguise the seams. A guard glancing into the cell would see nothing but a solid wall. Parsons had turned candy and toothpaste into perfect camouflage. By late July 2006, everything was ready. The rope was finished, hidden behind the brick, strong enough, long enough. Parsons had also made preparations for after the escape. He'd contacted his mother through covert messages, hinting that she should leave supplies at her home. She lived in Frankfurt, a small village near Chillicothe, about 10 miles from the jail. She agreed to help, quietly placed a camping tent and supplies on her back porch. If John could make it there, he'd have gear, clothing, a chance to survive in the woods. Parsons also reached out to a friend, a former co-worker he trusted. The plan was simple. If Parsons made it outside the jail walls, the friend would be waiting nearby, with a change of clothes, water, maybe a ride. Then, Parsons would disappear into the woods before anyone realized what happened. July 29th, 2006, a Saturday morning. Hot, humid, a typical Ohio summer day. Parsons had chosen Saturday for a reason. Weekends meant skeleton crews, fewer guards, more chaos during shift changes. 11 a.m. The scheduled recreation hour approached. Parsons and a group of inmates were led up to the rooftop yard. Would this be his last chance at freedom? 11:15 a.m. On the rooftop. The sun beat down on the concrete. Prisoners milled around the caged area, some playing basketball, others just sitting, enjoying the fresh air. Parsons had smuggled his rope with him, coiled tightly, hidden under his shirt. He waited, watching the guard on duty, timing the moment. 11:20 a.m., the guard stepped aside, got distracted by something, turned away from the yard for just a moment. This was it. Parsons moved quickly to a corner of the yard, near the chain-link fence. In seconds, he secured one end of his homemade rope to the fence, pulled it tight, tested it. Other inmates noticed, stared, some shouted. But by then it was too late. Parsons grabbed the rope, hoisted himself up the fence, climbed toward the top of the brick wall. His hands burned on the rough materials, the newspaper, the twisted bed sheets. But the rope held. At the top, razor wire coiled in thick loops, sharp, gleaming in the sunlight. Would the wire shred his hands? Would it hold his weight? Parsons had prepared for this too. He'd fashioned crude hooks from metal scraps, used them to pull back sections of the wire, created a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. He swung a leg over the edge of the wall. Below him, 30 feet down, the ground, freedom. Behind him, the alarm began blaring. Guards rushed to the corner of the yard, shouting. But Parsons was already descending. Hand over hand, sliding down the exterior wall. The knotted sheets and braided paper burned his palms, but it held. The rope held. Within seconds, he'd descended nearly 30 feet. By the time guards reached the wall and looked over, John Parsons was already on the ground. He let go of the rope, dropped the last few feet onto the grass, and ran. Sirens wailed through the summer air. Parsons sprinted across the open perimeter, toward the tree line beyond the jail grounds. Just as planned, his friend was waiting, among the trees at a prearranged spot. The friend handed Parsons a dark t-shirt, a bottle of water. Parsons tore off his orange jail uniform, threw on the civilian clothes, took a long drink. There was no time for conversation. Sirens were screaming from the jail. Shouting grew louder as guards fanned out searching. With a quick nod, Parsons dashed deeper into the woods. And then he was out. The woods of Ross County, just past noon. For the first time in over a year, No walls, no bars, no guards counting heads. Just the sound of leaves crunching beneath his feet. Just the cool shade of the forest canopy. Just the open trails stretching for miles ahead. In minutes, he'd gone from confined prisoner to fugitive, racing through the forest. Vanished. But where do you hide when an entire state is looking for you? Chaos erupted in Chillicothe. News spread fast. An accused cop killer had escaped from Ross County Jail, in broad daylight, from a rooftop recreation yard. How was that even possible? Sheriff Ron Nichols immediately mobilized every resource. This wasn't just any escape, this was personal. Parsons had killed one of their own, Officer Larry Cox, beloved by the department, by the community, and now he was loose. Nichols threw everything at the manhunt. Sheriff's deputies, local police, state troopers. They set up roadblocks on every highway leading out of Ross County, stopped cars, searched trunks, questioned drivers. K-9 units rushed to the wooded areas around the jail. Dogs picked up Parsons' scent, led officers into the dense forest. A helicopter buzzed overhead, scanning with infrared cameras, looking for heat signatures in the thick greenery. The first frantic hours came up empty. It was as if John Parsons had evaporated into thin air. In reality, by nightfall, he was already miles away, keeping to the underbrush, moving carefully, avoiding lights and roads. That night, Parsons made his way toward Frankfort, where his mother had left supplies. He approached cautiously, sticking to dark fields and back roads. As he got closer, he spotted a problem. Police cars everywhere, cruisers parked along the quiet village streets, officers visibly watching his mother's house. They'd anticipated this, of course they had. From a wooded area at the edge of town, Parsons could see the back porch, the camping tent, the supplies, right there. But officers were lying in wait. Going there would be suicide. Was there anyone left he could trust? Parsons slipped away, left the supplies untouched. From that moment on, he was completely on his own. The next morning, Sunday, July 30th, Chillicothe woke to shocking headlines. Cop killer escapes jail. Manhunt underway. The community was on edge. Many couldn't believe it. A prisoner escaping from their local jail. In broad daylight, from a rooftop. But citizens rallied to help law enforcement. Dozens of volunteers joined search parties. They knew Officer Cox. Some had been his friends, his neighbors. This wasn't just about catching a fugitive. It was personal. Tips flooded the sheriff's office. Every suspicious movement, every figure in the woods, prompted calls. Police followed up on each one. Sometimes they found nothing. Other times they found tantalizing clues. A prison-issued slipper near a creek, a piece of orange fabric snagged on thorns, fresh footprints in mud. Each discovery sent excitement through the search teams. But each time, the trail went cold. John Parsons, it seemed, was always one step ahead. In the days that followed, Parsons lived the life of an outlaw. He knew these woods, these hills, these back roads. He'd grown up around Chillicothe. That local knowledge became his lifeline. August passed. Days turned to weeks. By day, he'd lie low, hiding in dense thickets, holing up in abandoned barns, ramshackle hunting shacks deep in the forest. By night, under cover of darkness, he'd move camp, venture closer to town to scavenge food. He drank from creeks. When hunger gnawed, he foraged. Corn from fields, wild berries, scraps from trash cans. There were nights he sat in cold rain, soaked, shivering, gnawed by hunger. The loneliness was crushing, sometimes worse than prison walls. But morning would come, the sun would rise, and the primal instinct to survive drove him forward. How long could anyone survive like this? Every snapping twig could be officers closing in, every barking dog in the distance. It kept him alert, constantly moving. Once, while hiding in thorns, he heard a police dog barking just yards away. Parsons held his breath, didn't move. The dog sniffed, closer, 10 feet away, 5 feet. The officer called the dog back. He remained frozen for an hour after they left, heart pounding, knowing that one sneeze would have ended everything. Could he really stay free? Sheriff Nichols was determined, publicly confident that Parsons would be found. For Nichols, this was about honor, about justice for Officer Cox. Every cold trail was a professional failure, an insult to Cox's memory. Nichols suspected correctly that Parsons had help. He told reporters there was no question the fugitive was getting help out there. He vowed to prosecute anyone hiding him. Investigators confirmed those suspicions. They arrested his mother, charged her with obstruction of justice for leaving the tent and supplies. They tracked down the friend who'd helped him at the tree line, charged him for providing the getaway clothes and water. Other associates were questioned, pressured. Law enforcement was systematically cutting off every resource Parsons had. With no one left to help, how much longer could he last? With his family and friends facing charges, Parsons knew seeking further help would only make things worse. He was effectively isolated. But still, he slipped through the dragnet. August turned to September 2006. September 1st, over 30 days on the run. September 15th, 45 days free. The search continued relentlessly. National news picked up the story. John Parsons appeared on America's Most Wanted, twice. His face broadcast to millions of viewers. Sightings were reported across multiple states, but the most credible tips came from within Ross County. There were moments when authorities came agonizingly close. Once, a search team discovered a smoldering campfire in remote woods, footprints leading away, signs they'd just missed him. Another time, a farmer reported someone had broken into his cabin, slept there, left hours before officers arrived. Each near miss steeled law enforcement's resolve. By late September, nearly 2 months had passed. September 30th, 2006. The FBI added John Parsons to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. He became the 484th person ever added to that list. Now every bounty hunter in America would be looking for him. Could he still hide? The pressure skyrocketed. The reward jumped to $125,000. Now bounty hunters joined the search. Vigilant citizens across the country watched for him. Still, Parsons remained hidden. In truth, he never fled far. The familiarity of the area gave him an advantage. He stayed in the forests and rural areas he knew best. But was staying so close to the jail a brilliant move or a fatal mistake? After 83 days, the forest had become another kind of prison. The constant vigilance wore him down. He was exhausted, physically, mentally. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a potential captor. He was getting sloppy. The final break came in mid-October 2006. Among hundreds of tips, one stood out. Reports of a man lurking around an old lumber yard, Eastern Avenue Lumber, on the outskirts of Chillicothe. On the property sat a small, dilapidated storage shack, perfect shelter for a desperate fugitive. A co-owner of the lumber yard called police. He'd checked the shack, found freshly opened cans of food. His brother had heard about it from a hunter the day before. Acting swiftly, a tactical team set up surveillance. They noticed fresh footprints in mud, food wrappers near the shack. Someone had been living there. Was this finally the break they'd been waiting for? October 19th, 2006, around noon. Officers decided to move in. The Ross County Tactical Assault Team approached the weather-beaten shack. Multiple units, heavily armed. They took positions at every door and window. 12:20 p.m. Inside, John Parsons was asleep, exhausted from months on the run. In a coordinated rush, they stormed in. "Police, don't move!" Multiple voices shouted, breaking the silence. Parsons awoke to guns aimed directly at him. In that split second, he had no fight left. He just raised his hands, surrendered. Would he have traded those 83 days for life in prison? After 83 days as a fugitive, John Parsons was captured without a struggle. The manhunt was over. Relief swept through Chillicothe. That afternoon, the Chillicothe Gazette published a special edition, an enormous headline. "We got him." A woman sold over 100 copies on Main Street, just holding them up to passing drivers. It was an indication of how deeply Officer Cox's death had affected the community. At a press conference, Sheriff Nichols stood with FBI agents. Officer Cox's family stood beside them. Joy Cox, Larry's mother, addressed the media with tears in her eyes. She called it a blessed day, an answer to prayers. The crowd broke into applause. The nightmare that had gripped their community for 3 months was finally over. What investigators discovered shocked them. Parsons had been living in that shack for weeks, less than 2 miles from the jail he'd escaped from. He'd made himself comfortable, stockpiled food, settled in for the long term. And there was something else, something disturbing. Parsons had stolen lights from Officer Larry Cox's grave at the cemetery, used them to illuminate his hideout at night. The man who'd killed Cox was using lights from his victim's grave to survive. It was a detail that made the capture feel even more necessary. John Parsons was quickly transferred from Ross County Jail, this time to a maximum security state facility, the Ohio Corrections Reception Center in Orient, southwest of Columbus. They weren't taking chances again. On the same day, October 19, 2006, shortly after 3 p.m., Parsons appeared in Ross County Common Pleas Court. To avoid the death penalty and additional charges, Parsons made a deal. He pleaded guilty, 1 count of aggravated murder, multiple other charges. The judge additional concurrent sentences for the remaining charges: 10 years for aggravated robbery, 5 years for tampering with evidence, 18 months for each grand theft count, and 8 years for escape, to be served consecutively. There would be no second chances. John Parsons would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The judge explained the sentence. He noted that the good done by Officer Larry Cox was not buried with him, that it lives on today. Cox's service to the community, the premeditated nature of the crime, the escape that terrorized an entire county. All of it justified the harshest possible sentence. Parsons is currently serving his sentence at a facility in Youngstown, Ohio. His story was featured on National Geographic's Breakout documentary series, Episode 6. He even participated in telling the story himself. But unlike in the movies, this real-life escape story had no happy ending. For all his clever planning, the toothpaste camouflage, the candy-colored mortar, the braided rope, the 83 days evading capture, Parsons ended up right back where he started. Locked in a cell, this time forever. To this day, John Parsons' escape remains one of the most brazen in Ohio history. The ingenuity of using toothpaste and Jolly Ranchers to disguise his work, the rope made from bed sheets and toilet paper, the daylight escape from a rooftop. It was audacious, clever, almost cinematic, but it proved something fundamental about prison escapes. They might succeed for a while, days, weeks, even months. But in the end, freedom gained through violence always comes at a price. Officer Larry Cox paid with his life, doing his duty, trying to protect his community. John Parsons paid with his freedom, forever locked away, no chance of parole, no second chance at life. And the community of Chillicothe paid with 3 months of fear, wondering when the man who killed their officer would be caught. The story of John Parsons is a reminder that some escapes, no matter how clever, are never worth the cost. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.